so much, and let me just start by saying it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you this morning to address this very important and very topical subject. I'm a research officer at the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, and on behalf of the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, I'd like to first of all thank Civita and especially Eric for doing the heavy work here on the ground in Oslo and putting everything together. I mean, so far everything's been excellent, and we very much look forward to further cooperation with you in the future. I'd also like to thank all of you who have come here this morning, because if we would organize an 8 o'clock breakfast meeting in Brussels on Monday morning, we would not get close to so many people coming as we've got here today. So thank you very much. I'd also like to give a very special thank you to Vladimir from Open Russia, and I very much look forward to hearing personally as well what you have to say on this important subject and what your insights are into the Russian elections and what we can expect from them. To those of you who do not know, the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies is the political foundation and think tank of the European People's Party, or EPP, which is the biggest, largest group in the European Parliament at the moment. The Martens Center conducts research on all aspects of European politics and international affairs, and promotes conservative, Christian, democratic, and other similar values in its research. One important topic for us has always been Russia and how the events and developments in Russia affect Europe and the countries beyond it as well. We publish multiple different types of publications on Russia, and we've all organized several important events on it. Just last week, for example, we hosted Mr. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, also from Open Russia, for a closed-door briefing on the forthcoming Russian elections. So let me turn into the main topic of today, which is the Russian elections. My view is on this subject that we could easily take the question mark off the title of this event, because these elections are absolutely rigged in favor of Mr. Putin. The current Russian presidential campaign is essentially a circus, which is authorized, managed, and directed from the Kremlin. The reason for this is that Putin's most notable competitor, Mr. Alexei Navalny, for example, has been prevented from running in the elections. The Russian state controls most of the media in the country, which prevents genuine political debate from emerging. And even some political opponents of Mr. Putin have been assassinated, most famously Mr. Boris Nemtsov in 2015. But in order to create at least a thin image of democracy, some candidates have been allowed to run in these elections against and even criticize Mr. Putin. The most famous of these is Ms. Ksenia Sobchak, who has even openly criticized Putin on certain occasions. But this is all a managed process that allows the Kremlin to have a hint of legitimacy in the elections. And it's a very typical aspect of what people call managed democracy in Russia. Managing these elections is also a very typical aspect of the current Putinist system in Russia. And it's important to understand that managing these elections is not only in the interest of Mr. Putin himself, but it's also in the interest of the broader Russian elite that has risen to the top of the current system under Mr. Putin. Putinism can be understood as a political and economic system in which political power is achieved through the distribution of rents. It's a political and economic system in which both institutions and elections are essentially unimportant. It's about patron-client relations, of which there can be many, but all of which in the end trace back to the Russian president. It's also important to emphasize that Putinism doesn't refer only to Mr. Putin himself, but it also refers to the broader Russian elite and all of those individuals who have risen to the top of the Russian society under Mr. Putin. As long as Mr. Putin in power, they have a stake in the system, and if Mr. Putin goes away, they also risk being thrown to the side. But what does these elections mean for the West? Well, following the 2012 Russian presidential elections, we all know that Russian foreign policy became much more assertive, and we got things like the war that is going on in Ukraine and the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, and then Russian involvement in Syria. At the moment, it's very difficult to say. Some people say that there will be no major changes in Russian foreign policy. Others say that because of the very decisive measures that the West, the United States and the European Union, such as the sanctions, have taken in the past, Russia will be forced to moderate its foreign policy. What is positive is that the Western Front has stayed quite firm against Mr. Putin and Russia in the past. It's very positive that despite everything that has happened in the United States, it seems now that the United States genuinely recognizes Russia as a threat and as a competitor, and this is clear from the 2017 National Security Strategy and the 2018 National Defense Strategy. It's also very positive and encouraging that despite all the initial hesitation and differences of opinion between EU member states, the EU sanctions on Russia have held so well. This has surprised many, and like probably nobody more than Mr. Putin himself. So keeping these sanctions in force, no matter like what happens immediately after the elections, will be a priority for Europe. There's also like no reason to expect that whatever happens in these elections, that Russia would decrease its hostile influence operations against the West. As long as Mr. Putin and the Kremlin see that the benefits of interfering in our election processes outweigh the cost that we are able to impose on him, these operations will continue, because it's a very low way for him to essentially wage what is information warfare. So this is something that we as the West will continue to have to deal with, and we have to find new ways to tackle it. So my view is that the 2018 presidential elections are absolutely rigged in favor of Mr. Putin. Putin and the Russian elite, they run a managed democracy in which elections are kept under tight control of the Russian elite, and some opposition candidates are allowed to run, but only for show. And we will see in the months that follow the elections, like what the effects will be on Russian foreign policy. Although at this stage, little immediate changes can be expected. Thank you very much, and I very much look forward to hearing what Vladimir has to say.
Thank you, Niklas. Thank you for your introduction. And as mentioned earlier, Mr. Kara-Murza has been killed 2 times by poisoning, and it is, as I understand, a bit of a medical miracle that he has survived, let alone recovered so well. Being in favor of real democracy in Russia is no walk in the park, and Civita take great pride in providing a voice to the brave activists who are fighting this fight. So, Mr. Kara-Murza, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Niklas, for the introduction. I want to thank Civita and the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies for organizing and hosting our meeting this morning. I know it's an old tradition, a noble tradition now, of these breakfast meetings here at Café Christiani. I've been a part of them myself a few times on the other side in the audience, so I'm very honored to be joining you this morning and grateful for the opportunity to discuss what we still, by force of habit, call an election in Russia. There was an old joke in the Soviet times. One morning, the chairman of the local electoral commission runs into his office, pulling out his hair in panic, and his assistant asks, "What's going on? What's the problem?" And he says, "Somebody broke into my safe and stole all the official election returns." And the assistant says, "Well, that's okay. They've all been published in newspapers." And the chairman says, no, you don't understand. They stole the returns for the next election. And there was a brief time in Russia when this joke was irrelevant. I'm old enough to remember when elections in Russia were actually determined by how people voted. I'm old enough to remember when voters had a choice in Russian elections. When, for example, national parliamentary elections were won by the opposition, as they were in 1993 and 1995. I'm old enough to remember when the two leading presidential candidates, the incumbent and the main opposition challenger, were separated by just 3% and had to go into a runoff, into a second ballot to decide the outcome. I keep saying I'm old enough to remember this because, of course, now we have an entire new generation of Russians who have grown up not knowing anything else other than Vladimir Putin. Those Russian citizens who just turned 18 and who will come to vote for the first time this Sunday will have been born under Vladimir Putin. This is how long he's stayed in power. He's now been in power longer than Leonid Brezhnev, the symbol of Soviet totalitarian stagnation. And of course, one of the first targets of Mr. Putin when he came to power was the institution of free elections. If you look at the reports of the international observation missions from the Council of Europe and from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, you will see that the last time we had anything close to a democratic election was back in March of 2000, 18 years ago. Even that was debatable, but according to the reports, that was the last time. Every national election in Russia since then, parliamentary and presidential, has fallen far short of basic democratic standards. It's been said that the surest sign of a truly democratic election is when you are certain about the procedures, but not certain about the outcome. For years now, elections in our country have followed the exact opposite model. The procedures and the rules have been shifted and changed all the time to suit the incumbent authorities. A good example of this is that this time they actually passed an entire new federal law, or an amendment to the federal law, to make sure the election date was moved. It was supposed to be yesterday, March 11th, but they moved it to the 18th, so it coincides with the anniversary of the annexation of Crimea to add propaganda value. So the rules and the procedures are shifted all the time, but the end result, the end outcome, is never in doubt. I had a conversation a few days ago with members of the OSCE observation missions who are in Moscow now to observe the presidential election. And we were talking about them, and you know, they said that they already have their return flights from Moscow booked for next week. And so I asked them, so you don't even contemplate, in theory, the possibility of a second round? And of course it was a joke, and quite appropriately they laughed. So the theme of our conversation this morning is whether this election is rigged in favor of Vladimir Putin. When people think of rigged elections, the images that usually come to minds is, you know, ballot stuffing or rewriting of the vote tallies. And we do have all of that happening in Russia also, to be sure. I mean, for example, there's a member of the Legislative Assembly in St. Petersburg for Mr. Putin's United Russia Party. His name is Anatoly Drozdov, and he's much better known in political circles as Deputy Haircoom. And the reason for that is that back in 2011, when we had the previous parliamentary election, he was caught on camera. An observer filmed him on a smartphone camera. He's trying to stuff the ballots into the box, and the pile was so thick it wouldn't go through, so he had to take a haircoom and try to shove it in to make sure it pushes. So Deputy Haircoom is how he's been known ever since. We have several regions in Russia where the official election results show a 99% turnout and a 99% vote for Vladimir Putin. I don't know, I've never met anybody who actually believes that those are the results, but we have several regions in Russia who officially report them. Sometimes it's been more. In one of the previous parliamentary elections in the Republic of Mordovia, several precincts reported 104 or 109% for United Russia, the ruling party led by Vladimir Putin. But apart from those blatant and brazen examples of genuine vote rigging, there are much more subtle methods of control and manipulation that are also used. For example, the use of what we call administrative resources, which is when pressure is applied on voters who are dependent on state or municipal employment, which there are many of in Russia, when pressure is applied on students or on pensioners. There is, of course, the government control of all the major media outlets, which was the first thing Mr. Putin made sure of when he came to power, taking over or shutting down every independent nationwide television network in the first 3 years of his rule. And you know, for years now, state television, which is the main source of information for the vast majority of Russian citizens, has been offering laudatory and uncritical coverage of the regime and Mr. Putin himself, and presenting his opponents as traitors, enemies of Russia, and foreign agents. I think, we can hardly speak of a level playing field in this kind of situation. But we don't even need to talk about any of those methods either. Because frankly, I think it's enough to mention one fact about the Russian presidential election, or so-called presidential election of 2018. There were two genuine opposition figures who were planning to challenge Mr. Putin in the election this year. One was Boris Nemtsov, the former deputy prime minister of Russia, the leader of the democratic opposition, the most recognizable face of the democratic opposition in Russia, who has led mass protest marches, exposed corruption and abuses by officials, campaigned internationally for some sort of accountability in the form of targeted sanctions on human rights abusers and corrupt officials. And the second was Alexei Navalny, the anti-corruption activist who has spent the past year campaigning all across the country, opening campaign offices in dozens of regions, attracting hundreds of volunteers and thousands of people at rallies everywhere he went. And neither of them will be on the ballot this coming Sunday. Boris Nemtsov because he was killed as he walked across a bridge in front of the Kremlin 3 years ago last week. And Alexei Navalny because he was deliberately disenfranchised from the election by a decision, by court decision of the Russian authorities that was already overturned by the European Court of Human Rights, which described it as arbitrary and unfair, but they still use it to take him off the ballot. It's not difficult to win an election when your opponents are not actually on the ballot. And when we're talking about whether this election is rigged or not, of course it was, and it was rigged long before the first vote was even cast. And this was the case in all the previous elections under Vladimir Putin. So when, the Kremlin keeps repeating this propaganda mantra that Vladimir Putin is so apparently highly popular among Russian citizens. And sometimes, too often to my mind, this is being repeated uncritically and taken at face value by Western media and Western commentators. Well, why would such a popular leader be so afraid of a free election? And I think it's important to remind ourselves that this so-called popularity of Vladimir Putin has never, not once, been tested in a free and fair election against genuine opponents. And I think it's important to remember that. And since we're meeting this morning here in Oslo, in the capital of our fellow member state in the Council of Europe and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, I want to touch briefly on the international aspect of this so-called election. This year, the Council of Europe was not invited to observe the Russian election in breach of our membership terms, but the OSCE was, and there's now a large mission in Moscow observing. The long-term mission is already there. The short-term mission is arriving in the next couple of days to observe the presidential election. And as I mentioned already, every time since the year 2000 or after the year 2000, OSCE observers determined, and Council of Europe observers who were invited before, determined that elections in Russia were not free, not fair, and not democratic. And yet there's this amazing disconnect that just after the observers from Western democratic countries concluded that the elections were not free, not fair, and not democratic, the leaders of those same Western countries, the democratically elected presidents, prime ministers, and chancellors, picked up the phone to call Putin to congratulate and to accept the legitimacy of those elections. I'm puzzled as to how those two things make sense. I will never forget the day or the evening of the 5th of March 2012. This was the day after our last presidential election. There was a big protest rally on Pushkinskaya Square, right in central Moscow, a couple of kilometers down from the Kremlin. Tens of thousands of people who came to protest the stealing of their votes. I remember we were standing on the stage, on the main stage. All the leaders of the Russian opposition were there: Boris Nemtsov, Alexei Navalny, Garry Kasparov, Grigory Yavlinsky, many others, and just tens of thousands of people came together to express their protest, and you could see the sea of faces and flags. And at about the same time that we were standing there, we got news that the United States government issued an official notice of congratulations, not only to Vladimir Putin, this would have been half the problem, but to the people of Russia for having held this presidential election. We weren't sure whether to take that as a mockery or an insult. And to be fair, this is not just the Americans. You know, the first Western leader to call Mr. Putin at that time was British Prime Minister David Cameron, who called at about the same time as Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and Hugo Chavez. Now, as I said, there's a large long-term, which will be joined by a short-term component, OSCE mission to observe this year's presidential election, so-called presidential election in Russia. And if their conclusions are anything like the ones that have been reached every single time for the last 15 years and more, we really hope that the leaders of Western democratic nations do not rush to their phones to congratulate Mr. Putin, in effect, on a successful theft, because that's what they would be congratulating him on. We hope that they do not legitimize the results of this manipulation and fraud. I think this is the least we can expect of countries that pride themselves on the rule of law and on democratic governance. Now, everything I've just been talking about relates to the official side, the government side of what's happening in Russia. The side that is too often equated with Russia as a whole. There's no Russia without Putin, as Duma Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin told us a few years ago. I can think of nothing more insulting to say about my country. But apart from being insulting, it's also not true. Because despite the propaganda and the intimidation and the pressure, there are many people in Russia who reject this regime and who reject what it stands for. In the last few months, thousands, tens of thousands of people went to the streets all across the country to voice their protest at the pervasive government corruption, the lack of accountability, the sham elections, the sheer arrogance of the same small group of people that has now held power for almost 2 decades. These protests took place in more than 200 towns and cities across Russia, across 11 time zones. Towns large and small, literally from Kaliningrad to Khabarovsk. And the vast majority of those who came to protest were young people, university and high school students, many in their late teens and early 20s, the people who literally represent the future of Russia. They're also the people, as we've just been discussing, who have spent their entire adult lives, or in many cases their entire lives, under Vladimir Putin, who were raised and many were born under him, who have no other political memories. And yet it is that generation that is increasingly beginning to say, enough. I think this is a very important moment. I think this could be a turning point, and I think this is a very worrying sign for Mr. Putin and his people. I'd certainly be worried if I were in their place right now. But I think this is a very hopeful sign for the future of Russia.
Thank you.
Thank you once again for this opportunity to look forward to the
First of all, let me apologize for the problems with the sound here. I'm not sure what happened. They worked better earlier. Had I been a Russian democracy activist, I would have been a bit paranoid for somebody interfering or hacking the system. You just have to take your microphone as close as you can, and we will talk as slow as we can and try to mediate as well. Again, apologizes for the sound. We will do our best to speak as you can hear us. So I will open up for questions. I noticed Mikhail already. So Henrik, if you can deliver the microphone to Mikhail. And for everybody else who want to take the floor, please give me a sign and I will recognize you. Please, the floor is yours.
First, I would like to thank you for a much interesting keynote speak. My question is very simple. Can this system be reformed from inside?
Thank you for the question. I think one of the most ironic things about the behavior of the current regime is that if you look at their behavior, even if you listen to what they've been saying over the past almost 2 decades now, it seems that the biggest thing they're afraid of are street protests, are people on the streets who are coming out to protest against this government. The type of, what they call a color revolution scenario that have happened in Serbia, in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Moldova, and other places. So they're saying that's what they're most afraid of. I mean, they've set up special organizations like Nashi to try to combat this perceived threat. They keep accusing Western countries and Western governments of funding the supposed revolutionary forces. Of course, they keep accusing us, Russian opposition leaders, of trying to prepare something like this in cahoots with Western governments, apparently. And yet the ironic thing is that if anybody is preparing such a scenario, a street scenario in Russia, it is the people who have eliminated elections as a meaningful institution. It's the people who have turned parliament into a rubber stamp. It's the people who are censoring and controlling television. It's the people who have removed every normal, peaceful, constitutional way of changing the government. There is no way to change our government now through the ballot box, because all this process, as we've been discussing, is completely manipulated and controlled. So if anybody is preparing that type of scenario of a change of government in Russia, it is the people who are in the Kremlin now. So I do not see the possibility of this regime reforming itself from within. I do not see the possibility, and this is just stating plainly the obvious, that this regime will be changed at the ballot box, because we have no ballot box to speak of. And one thing we do know from Russian history, certainly modern Russian history going a century or so back, is that big political changes in our country usually start quickly and unexpectedly. And I'm a historian myself by education. I've studied 1905, I've studied 1917. I'm old enough myself to remember August 1991, when the Soviet communist regime that had existed for 74 years went down in 3 days. This is how things happen in Russia. And so I think it is our responsibility as the democratic opposition, as a responsible democratic opposition, to be already today preparing for that future transition, because the other side of the coin of this change happening quickly and unexpectedly is that nobody's ever prepared for it. And that's why so many mistakes keep being made. Certainly in the early 90s under President Yeltsin, a lot of the mistakes that were not made through bad intentions or through malice, but because people who came to power were simply not ready for this. Power just fell on their hands. And so we know that when that moment comes, we don't know when or how the moment of change in Russia will come, but we know that it will, because nothing is forever. And Mr. Putin sometimes behaves in a way that, sometimes people think that he actually believes he's going to be there forever, but he isn't. Things will change. Again, we don't know precisely how, precisely when, but we know they will. And so I think it is our responsibility to be preparing for that change. And this is what we're doing. The main focus of our work at the Open Russia movement, which I represent here this morning, is to get ready for that future transition, both in terms of substance and in terms of the people who will be doing it. So in terms of substance, for example, we have several working groups under our auspices who are working on preparing drafts for future reform projects in different areas that will need to be implemented in that transition. We had a big report on constitutional reform a few years ago. We had a report on economic demonopolization. We had a report on energy reform. Eric mentioned Vladimir Milov, who spoke here a few years ago. He's actually one of the people who was working with us on some of these reports, and many, many others too. So this is in terms of the substance. In terms of the people, a lot of what we're doing at Open Russia is directed at training and educational projects aimed at the new generation. Those very young democratic activists and civil society activists that I've been talking about, that are coming out to the streets, that are increasingly becoming involved, both civically and politically. And the way we do this, for example, one of the ways we do this is by setting up election infrastructures. Given everything I just said about elections in Russia, we know it's not possible to win in these elections for us as the opposition, but it's still possible to learn. It's still possible to use the infrastructure to learn. So what we have been doing in the last almost 4 years now, since we launched Open Russia as a political movement, is we have been helping these young activists all across the country to run as candidates, to be campaign managers, to be campaign volunteers, again, because when they go through this, they learn how to do these things, how to walk door to door, how to speak to people, how to speak at rallies, how to publish leaflets in newspapers, how to campaign. And they're the wiser for it. And of course, we know it's not very easy to try to prepare for democracy under an authoritarian system, but we're using what tools and what instruments and what opportunities we have. And I always compare it with, there was a famed Soviet pianist in the 20th century. His name was Rudolf Kara. So he was an ethnic German. And when the war began in 1941, he was exiled along with his family to Kazakhstan, and where he spent 13 years in that internal exile. And needless to say, wherever he was living in the wooden barrack in the middle of the steppe somewhere, he did not have a piano with him. So what he did is he took out a plank of wood and a knife, and he carved out a pretend keyboard on that plank of wood, and he would practice on it every day just so his fingers wouldn't forget. And he did this for 13 years, and then in the 50s under Khrushchev, he was allowed to return back to Moscow. He went on to become a soloist at the Moscow Philharmonic. He taught at the Moscow Conservatoire. He won the USSR Musical Soloist Competition in 1962. He's one of the most accomplished pianists of his time. And for 13 years, the man had practiced on a plank of wood. This is what we're doing today. We're using the tools and the opportunities we have to try to prepare that generation that will be responsible for building a new Russia once the Putin system is gone.
Let me repeat the speakers list. I have a few names who've been added on. First, Eva, you'll get the floor in just a second. I also registered Erik, I registered Gunnar, and I registered you sitting there, and also Ragnhild and Gunnar. First, Eva.
Thank you very much. My name is Ivar Amundsen. I have my friends in the Russian opposition. One of them was Boris Nemtsov, who came here exactly 6 years ago, just before the last election, presidential election in Russia. Just one little thing. Stalin was once asked about how it was possible to have free and fair elections in the Soviet Union. And he answered with a smile that the question is not to win the election, the question is to win the count-up. I belong to those who believe that Putin is trapped. He cannot leave office ever alive. And our friend Garry Kasparov has put it this way, that Putin has stolen too much money and killed too many people to ever dare to step down. Would you agree with that statement? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivar. And I absolutely believe that Putin wants to be president for life. Absolutely. I think he's done too many things in those 18 years that he is literally afraid for his freedom and for his life when he steps down. So yes, I do think that from his behavior of many years now, there's no question that he wants to stay in power for as long as he lives. It doesn't mean he will. If it was only up to dictators to stay in power forever, then every dictator everywhere in every country in the world would always stay in power forever, and we know that's not the case. There are other forces in history, there are other forces in society that sometimes change what the dictators are planning to do. But yes, I do think that is his intention. And you know, when people start asking, well, for example, is he working on preparing a successor for himself? No, I don't think he is. And you know, 10 years ago, people thought he was preparing a successor. In the end, he turned out to be a placeholder, not a successor. Mr. Medvedev, I don't think anybody remembers much now that we had a President Medvedev in Russia 10 years ago. So I completely agree with the premise you just expressed. Yes, he wants to be president for life. He wants to stay in power for as long as he lives, but I do not think he will. Because apart from Mr. Putin and his intentions, there are also other forces at play. And I think, you know, and I've spent the last 4 years since we've relaunched Open Russia as a movement. I say relaunched because originally Open Russia was launched back in 2001. Then when Mikhail Khodorkovsky was arrested and spent more than 10 years in prison, he was suspended and shut down. And when he was released from prison, we launched it again, this time as a full-fledged pro-democracy political movement. And since then, we've been working actively to set up an infrastructure in the regions because we're trying to build a truly nationwide grassroots political movement. For too long, all politics in Russia have been happening in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And this is not normal. Russia's bigger than that. And so we're trying to build a genuinely horizontal movement across the regions. And as of today, we have 29 regional branches, regional chapters across Russia. We still have a long way to go. There are many more regions in Russia than that, but we do have representation in a lot of places. And I've been myself to a lot of these places, from Kaliningrad to Irkutsk. And everywhere I went, and everywhere we're working, and everywhere we're holding public events such as this one, there are always many interested, active young people who come and who take part in our events and who are prepared to work with us despite the risks, despite being labeled foreign agents or members of an undesirable organization, which we officially are now, as having been declared that by the Russian General Prosecutor's Office a year ago. Despite the risks, despite the dangers, there are many, many people across the country who think that Russia deserves better, and the Russian people deserve better than to be ruled by a corrupt, authoritarian, kleptocratic regime, than to be ruled by a single man for almost 2 decades now. I mean, it's not normal for a European country in the 21st century to have one man in power for 20 years. These things shouldn't happen. And more people in Russia understand the link between all the problems that they see every day, the corruption, the lack of accountability, the lack of real judicial system, the daily abuses of the basic rights and freedoms of citizens, the link between all that and the fact that we've had one man in power for 20 years without term limits, without free elections, without any of the checks and balances or democratic institutions. And looking at those people, especially those young people, really gives me a lot of hope for the future of my country. So yes, I do think Mr. Putin wants to stay in power for life, but I don't think he will.